Mehet, akkor mehet.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dimitrios. I'm an attorney in Boston, Massachusetts. I handle international business transactions and litigation. And I have been judging international law school competitions that are held at the Alta Law School in Budapest for some years now. And I've had the occasion to visit Hungary for many times. There's also a large Hungarian-American community in Boston and the surrounding states. And in fact, if you look at the background I have, that is the statue commemorating the Hungarian independence. And this is located right behind my office. The purpose of this sort of meeting is to respond to a request by a group in Hungary known as the Doctors for the Truth to provide some information on the COVID-19 legislative and judicial progress in the US, which this organization in Hungary is hosting the second scientific COVID conference in Budapest. Thus, what I thought would make sense is to invite some other lawyers from the US to have a roundtable discussion in how we can protect medical freedom in the US during COVID-19. But with me tonight, today, I have an attorney who is a member of the America's Frontline Doctors legal team, an organization that has filed a case in the federal district court for the District of Alabama. And this was done in June of 2021, about a month ago. The complaint that was filed sets out a number of different claims against Anthony Fauci, the FDA, the US Department of Health and Human Services, the Food and Drug Administration of the US, the CDC, the National Institute of Health, and other entities. With me today is attorney Jonathan Diener, who is from New Mexico. And as I said before, he is a member of the legal team of America's Frontline Doctors. That is the plaintiff, one of the plaintiffs in the case that was filed in Alabama. So I do want to welcome Jonathan and ask Jonathan to perhaps tell us a little bit about himself and what he does as a starting point. So Jonathan, thank you for taking the time to participate in this discussion, and I welcome you on board.
Well, it's my pleasure, certainly. I'm actually a rather, what's the word? I'm a rather low-key attorney in the sense that I practice mostly in state court in New Mexico. And, you know, I do everything from divorces to criminal law to real estate and property cases. And I had relatively little experience in federal court and with federal law and constitutional claims. I had a little, but relatively little. But when this COVID, what I call COVID fascism started in this country, I felt like it was my responsibility to, you know, use my skills and my training to do something about it, to stand up against what I see as fascism coming to us through this sort of medical tyranny and you know, this whole COVID narrative that is largely based on falsehoods. So, you know, I did represent a restaurant who stayed open against the governor of New Mexico's mandates that said they had to close. And we actually did fairly well in that case. The judge was apparently sympathetic. And because the governor had reversed herself like twice, she first said they had to shut down, then they said that they were going to open, then she shut them down again, and then she opened them again. The judge basically said to the state, I'm not going to do anything to this restaurant. You know, I mean, he gave them a slap on the wrist with a few fines, but that was it. The state wanted them to shut down this restaurant. Anyway, from there, I met up with a lawyer from Santa Fe, New Mexico, and we decided to file a lawsuit model after a lawsuit in Ohio against the governor and basically against her entire public health emergency powers, except that perhaps in the very beginning when not much was known about COVID. So that suit is in federal court right now. Unfortunately, the judge has just sat on it for 4 months and not made a ruling on anything that's been presented to him. We don't know exactly why, but that case is on somewhat of a hold. We also filed a lawsuit in a county in New Mexico that had mandated that certain employees of that county be vaccinated, and that case is also pending. And I joined up with this team of lawyers that's throughout the country. There's about 7 of us at this point, I think. And that's how I got involved in the case in Alabama where we're suing the top dogs in the nation. I mean, Fauci and the FDA and the CDC. I mean, I've always been an attorney that had a feeling that justice, that justice is a lot more important than a financially rewarding career. And the COVID thing has really allowed me to satisfy my sense of what a lawyer is supposed to be doing.
Well, before we get into the details of the Alabama case, which the complaint itself is about 110 pages long. So before we sort of talk about the specifics of that case, I do want to mention a few things about some of the legislative measures that have been taken up by states over the last sort of year or so. And I understand that the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission at some point in time announced that employers could require workers to be vaccinated against the COVID-19 as long as as long as those acts did not violate the Americans with Disabilities and the Civil Rights Acts. And of course, that was the beginning of a lot of different proposals, legislative proposals in different states, where states now attempted to prohibit businesses from requiring COVID-19 vaccinations in order for people to work. And also there have been some legislative measures that have been filed in different states regarding the requirement that students or younger students actually be vaccinated as part of being able to attend school. So in doing a little bit of an analysis, I found that there are 141 types of legislative proposals that have been presented in different state legislatures. 117 of them relate to employer mandates, 53 relate to school mandates, and then 32 relate to this idea of a vaccine passport. Now, the vaccine passport idea has been something that has been talked about in the European Union a lot, and there has been a lot of movement in the European Union, much more, I would have to say, than in the US. And in sort of looking at the different legislative proposals, what I can say is that 6 states, for instance, have enacted legislation to limit the COVID-19 vaccination mandates, and those are Arkansas, Florida, Montana, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Utah. And there are 11 other states that ban the use of vaccine passports, and there are 31 other states that are sort of considering similar legislation. So we also have a lot of different attempts throughout the court system where legislators are trying to sort of prevent governors from enacting certain emergency type of, I should say, orders whereby the governor can can announce some kind of an executive order to take remedies. So there has been a lot of movement on that. So now, having sort of talked about all these legislative measures on a state level, do you know whether or not there's anything on a federal level that perhaps Congress is sort of considering or debating in terms of these types of mandates?
Well, I don't know anything about Congress really getting into the act, the United States Congress in this realm. I do know that there was an agency, and I can't remember the name of it, but it is it's a federal agency that put out a statement saying federal agencies should not mandate the vaccine for its employees. Mm-hmm. Now that came out about a month ago, if I recall, and it was advisory. It wasn't a statute or of any kind, but it was advisory. But I thought that was a good sign. And after that, it appears that some of the agencies have not followed that advice. As I understand it, the Veterans Administration has just in the last few days said that any employees for the Veterans Administration have to be vaccinated to continue to work there. And even Biden himself, I think, has said, of course, I don't know if he's still sticking by it, has said that there should not be any mandatory vaccines for federal employees. So, you've also got the military, that there's a lot going on with the military. There's a lot of coercion. There's a lot of, it's what I've heard is that people are really, they're being kind of, I don't know about threatened, but there's a lot of coercion going on for military people to be taking the vaccine. However, there is a statute that says military may not be mandated to take a vaccine that hasn't been fully authorized by the FDA without the president signing something overriding this law, basically. So the military cannot be mandated to take a vaccine unless Biden would actually sign something official saying he's overriding the law. I can't quite remember the name of the law, but in any case, there have been courts that have ruled on that law when an anthrax vaccine was in an experimental stage, an emergency use authorization stage. They tried to force the military to take those vaccines, and the military members brought a suit, and the federal judge said, you can't do that. And so, everything is sort of like up in the air right now, what's going to happen.
Well, it seems that...
Yeah, I don't know if Congress... Go ahead.
It seems that the states are more proactive, the state legislatures are more proactive in dealing with these issues as opposed to the federal government. And of course, that doesn't sort of exist in the European Union in the sense that each country does not have the state level we have in the federal court system that we have here. So we see a lot of activity on the state level and the state legislatures, but we do not see the same type of activity on the federal level. But let me sort of go back to the Alabama case, because I read the complaint and it was very well written, and it sort of describes a lot of different issues that I think it is important for us to touch upon. And one of the first challenges that I recall from the Alabama litigation case is the emergency use authorization. So you are one of the individual lawyers that signed that complaint that was filed in the federal court of Alabama. So tell me, what is the challenge to the emergency use authorization that the plaintiff in that case is sort of challenging?
Well, first of all, I mean, we're challenging that this drug should have ever been authorized because there was too much unknown about it. I call it a drug. It's not a traditional vaccine. It's not a piece of virus that you inject in someone so that they will be able to fight it off if it comes from from outside, from spread through the world. It's not like that. And I think if I'm talking to doctors in Hungary, I think they understand that. So I don't need to go into that. But there was a very limited trial period. I mean, I guess Trump although I like Trump, one of his big mistakes was trying to push through this vaccine at what he called warp speed. They didn't do enough testing. The testing that they did was very inconclusive. As I understand it, the testing basically showed that the vaccine would reduce symptoms of somebody that had gotten transmitted with the virus. The test that they ran did not even show that if somebody was vaccinated, it would prevent transmission of the virus should they get it. It really only showed that their symptoms would be reduced. So based on that, that's not enough to be, distributing a vaccine for mass use, even if it's so-called emergency use. But more than that, the EUA is based on a public health emergency. I mean, they were allowed to issue an EUA because there was a so-called public health emergency. And anyone who has really done serious research into the nature of COVID and the actual statistics of deaths and cases, they know that, number one, the PCR test, which has been the main vehicle for determining whether someone has the virus, is a totally invalid test. The inventor of the test said it himself, this is not a test for a disease or a virus. The way it's being used, the cycles that it's being run at, Fauci has admitted that there are going to be significant false positives. And Fauci, of course, is a cheerleader for all things, related to lockdowns and mask wearing and vaccination. But even he admitted that the PCR test run at the number of cycles that everyone is running it at it gives you way too many false positives for it to be a valid test. And so you've got all these people that are supposedly have COVID because what? They have a cold, they have sniffles, they have certain symptoms, and they tested positive. So the number of cases is completely wrong. And the number of deaths is completely wrong because people, when they're considered a death by COVID, it's really a death with COVID. And it's really a death oftentimes with some symptoms, but with a PCR test of positive, which is not a valid test. Now in Europe, Portugal courts and Austrian courts have actually made rulings that the PCR test is not a valid test for the COVID-19 disease. I mean, that's happened in Europe. We haven't had such a ruling in the US. But in any case, so the statistics of cases and deaths are completely wrong. So really the question is there a public health emergency? And if you really look at this with a clear eye, without all the pandemic, anxiety and fear-based narrative that's going out, you realize that this is basically, it's a virus. It's like a virus, like a flu virus, and it's not a public health emergency. It's certainly not now. If it ever was, at the very beginning, because people didn't really know much about it, maybe then it could have been classified as a public health emergency. But there's no public health emergency at this point if you really take an honest look at the statistics and what they really mean. So given that, you don't get an emergency use authorization without a public health emergency. And since there really isn't a public health emergency, the emergency use authorizations are really not valid. That's part of, I think that's part of the claim.
Now, let me ask you something else, Jonathan, because I was interested in the point that you and I talked about before we started this discussion, where you sort of identified, and that's part of the case as well, you identified the fact that recently the US government changed the requirements for what needs to go on a death certificate related to the COVID. Mm-hmm. And, right. That, from what I understand, reading the complaint, that basically means that this is something new. It wasn't done in the past. And I guess now doctors are required to do certain things. So can you perhaps elaborate on that point a little bit more? Because I think this is a fascinating point.
Right. I unfortunately don't understand exactly what the procedure is for declaring a death to be caused by COVID. What I do know is that the CDC had in place a set of rules for how to determine that a particular disease caused a death. It was, it's been in use since the early 2000s. I think 2003 or so is when they made that rule, and it's been in basically widespread use in the United States. When the COVID thing hit, they changed the rule, not for all diseases, only for COVID, which, it's almost like a red light flashing. Well, why only for COVID? Because they really are behind this idea that COVID is a serious pandemic that's threatening the world, and they are pushing that narrative. So now, when a doctor has much less stringent rules for saying this death was caused by COVID, and it's been admitted by certain health officials, like, for example, the Illinois Health Department director. She basically said, if somebody comes into a hospice with cancer and they know they're going to die within a few weeks, or they're predicted to be dying in a few weeks, they die and they've tested positive for cancer, we will call that a COVID death, a death caused by COVID. And one of Trump's COVID team, that he had appointed, I think Fauci was one of them, but there were others. There was a lady, I can't remember her name right. She admitted that basically, if somebody has COVID when they die, we consider that a COVID death, regardless if they had several other comorbidities that were actually more likely the cause of the death.
And why do you think that change was implemented? I mean, is it financially based? Is there a reason why it makes more sense to include, let's say, one of the 5 medical conditions that a patient may have, and assuming they enter the hospital, there's a diagnosis of like cancer and terminal cancer and a few other things, and now all of a sudden, a doctor determines that COVID is also one of the conditions. Why does it make sense to include that as the cause of death instead of one of the other conditions?
It doesn't. It simply doesn't. If what you're asking is, why would the CDC go about that and do that? Well, you're asking a very profound question. I mean, you're starting to ask a question of, why is it that this whole COVID narrative, which is basically based on false information in a large part, has been propagated through the world? If you want to ask that question, that gets pretty deep.
Yeah, but let's ask that question.
What's that?
Let's ask that question then, because that's a much more perhaps philosophical debate.
Okay. If you want my answer is that there are people who somehow are attracted to the idea of controlling the mass of humanity, of having the mass of humanity be in some way under their thumb, under their auspices, that they can tell them what to do, that they can scare the hell out of them and get them to basically follow their edicts, follow their rules as to how to live. Stay at home if they tell you to stay at home. Wear a mask if they tell you to stay a mask.
Okay.
There are people in the world who,
Well,
go ahead.
Why would somebody, whoever that group may be, why is it that they may have that interest? What's in it for them? Financially, I am sure they have huge sums of money. So why would they be sort of, let's say, incentivized by the notion of control to be able to take these drastic measures and create all this chaos around the world?
Well, what you really ask, the short answer, the one-word answer, evil. There is evil in the world. There is evil. There is such a thing. I mean, I have studied evil long before this COVID thing. I'm not a devout religious person either. But I believe there is evil, and I've seen it in action. And certainly, you know, people in Europe have seen it in action, certainly during the Second World War. There is such a thing. And there are people that's their get off. They enjoy that's what they're devoted to. They're committed to control, and this is something that each person has to learn about and decide for themselves. But that's my answer.
So, all right, and that probably is a discussion that will take hours. But I want to go back a little bit to this idea of the CDC changing the rules with respect to the declarations on the death certificates, because to me, there's got to be a motivation, and I'm just trying to understand what could be the motivation of the CDC and instrumentality of the U.S. government to kind of make that change. So from reading the complaint, reading the complaint that was filed in Alabama, what is it that your group, the lawyers are claiming in that case as to the reasons why there was a change in the death certificate declarations?
Well, I don't know that that's a part of this case. I mean, it may be a fact that's mentioned, but there is a separate lawsuit filed by one of the attorneys or a couple of the attorneys on this case against the CDC for doing just that, for changing the rules about how a death is classified. And it's a separate lawsuit. But, you know, again, if you're asking why would they do it, you know, the CDC, for whatever it's worth, they actually own, well, the NIH, I believe, is a sub-agency. The National Institute of Health is a sub-agency of the CDC. I'm not sure that, you know, the overarching organization is the Department of Health and Human Services, I believe it's called, or the Department of Health, and in any event. That's the overarching large agency. The CDC is a sub-agency, and the NIH is a sub-agency. And the NIH owns part of the patent for one of these vaccines. So every time a vaccine is sold, the NIH, which is, I believe it's a sub-agency of the CDC, they're making a profit. These agencies are very strange. They're not just government, they're like a hybrid of government and private. They're a hybrid organizations, and I don't really understand the legalities of that. But in any event, the NIH is making money every time a vaccine is sold. So if you want to look for a less profound reason why the CDC is doing these things, that's one. Another thing the CDC did, I just want to mention this. You know, it's well known that the cycles that a PCR test is run at will determine largely to the degree that the number of positive tests. For example, if somebody runs a PCR test at 28 cycles, they're going to get less positives than if they run at 35 cycles, quite a bit less. And they're all running them at 35 and above pretty much throughout all the testing. However, the CDC said, we are not going to consider someone that has been vaccinated and gets COVID an actual what's called crossover, or we're not going to consider that they, you know, that they got vaccinated and got the COVID disease unless the PCR test was done at 28 cycles or below. Can you believe that? I mean, the CDC has accepted that throughout the country, they're using it at 35 cycles or more, up to 40 for testing for COVID. But for a crossover, for someone that's been vaccinated, basically they're saying we don't want to know about these people that have been vaccinated and actually get COVID-19. We don't want to know about them. So we're going to only characterize it as a COVID if they tested at 28 cycles below. Now the CDC is saying we are not going to count it as a crossover unless they were hospitalized or died from COVID. So now we have no accurate information about people that are getting vaccinated and still getting COVID. Yeah. And it's from what I heard in England, In England, 60% of the new cases for COVID are from the vaccinated.
It's interesting
So,
to say that.
anyways, I'm a little.
It's interesting you mentioned this because I was talking to a client today in Greece, and she said that a lot of her friends that have been fully vaccinated got COVID, and some of them actually had to get antibiotics, and they were struggling with the with the COVID. So to me, it seems that what you are suggesting sort of is trickling down to some of the issues that people are identifying in the real world. But what you are also saying is those statistical tools or information doesn't show up anywhere, at least as of this time. Is that what's happening today? So people that actually got vaccinated.
I didn't understand.
Right. So people that got vaccinated, then got COVID, because of the way that the testing is done, those numbers don't show up in any statistics. Is that what?
That's correct. That's correct. That's correct. Right.
So,
and now, since it's only if you're hospitalized or die from it, I mean, that was just done fairly recently. They didn't have, originally they were trying to track anybody that got vaccinated and then got COVID. Then they said, no, we're not interested in only those that die or were hospitalized. Well, most people that get COVID don't die or get hospitalized. So, there is no reliable information anymore about crossovers.
One of the other elements in the complaint that was filed that I was curious about, you, and again, when I say you, I mean the group of lawyers, stated in the complaint that Pfizer earned $3.5 billion in the first quarter of 2021 alone, and Moderna got $1.7 billion just from the vaccines. I mean, these are huge amounts just in the first quarter of 2021. I mean, to me, it seems that there was a lot of discussion in the US that the vaccines were going to be produced for the benefit of the public. And somehow with that money-making machine that you guys are identifying, and I'm not sure of the numbers, it seems that the vaccines were not made for the public, but at least were not made to be used by the public in general without a cost. There is a cost. Somebody's making money, and these companies are making a significant amount of money. So
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So profit is,
I mean,
the driver here. It seems that way to me. Sorry, are you there, Jonathan?
I can't argue. I can't argue with you.
Yeah. The other point that I thought was interesting in the complaint, and you sort of, again, by you I mean, the group of lawyers that you've identified a lot of medical conditions as a result of the vaccination, and you've also attributed to over 45,000, I believe, deaths as a result of that vaccination. So is it the part of the claim that the reported deaths as a result of the vaccinations, the COVID vaccinations, are underreported as well? Is that part of the claim?
It certainly is. I never met with this person that is a whistleblower, but, and she wasn't named as, we didn't give out her name in the complaint, but she apparently works either within the CDC. I don't know if she works within the CDC or she works with I believe it may be that she works in a private company that audits or does work for the CDC, or, I'm not sure exactly, but, she contacted somebody in our group and basically said, and she provided some documentation for the fact that they are vastly underreported. And, the figure that she used came from documents that she was in possession of. Now, I haven't talked to her. I don't know even, I don't even know her name, but what I can say is that given the incredible fervor of the government and the media and everyone to get this vaccine into every, human being on the planet. I mean, in my state, our governor has said, she made a $10 million sweepstake where, get the vaccine and you'll have a right, a chance to win $250,000 every week. We're going to, award a new winner to somebody who's been vaccinated. I mean, why is there this fervor to have everyone vaccinated? Well, you can bet that with this fervor going on, if deaths are mounting from the vaccine, they would prefer not to be known by people. Makes sense to me.
Well, hold it. I've got a little bit of a sort of dilemma here in the sense that we've identified, or at least we've talked about the CDC changing the rules with respect to the death certificates, and if COVID is one of the conditions, and how the reporting is done. So now we have more deaths presumably being documented as a result of COVID. And then on the other hand, the claim also is that there's an underreporting of deaths. I mean, I just have a little bit of a difference. Can you explain that point, perhaps? So the CDC regulations were changed. Now we have more deaths reported as COVID. And then on the other hand, we don't have deaths reported from people that actually got the vaccines reported as COVID deaths. You understand what I'm trying to say?
Well, yeah, I don't know that there's really any conflict there. I mean, first of all, they seem to want to make any death that could even conceivably be considered a COVID death called a COVID death, because they were involved in a massive, what I think, scare campaign to the population. And so, if they can increase the number of deaths, if they can increase the number of cases with a faulty PCR test for cases, and if they can increase the number of deaths for, by saying that, the guy had cancer, but he tested positive for COVID, we'll call that a COVID death. I mean, they did that. I mean, this was long before the vaccine even, was involved. So when the vaccine was involved, they want to say it's perfectly safe and effective. And if you go to the CDC website in big letters, this vaccine is safe and effective. That they should never have been saying that, given that it was still an emergency use authorization. It had not been sufficiently tested. Yet they put that up on their website, big letters, safe and effective. And one of the things I want to mention, that the emergency use authorization that is part of the FDA regulations says, if it's an emergency use authorization for any drug, any medical product, any vaccine, you have to give any recipient of that vaccine the total information about the benefits from the vaccine, the possible side effects, the possible adverse effects of that vaccine. You have to give them information that this is an emergency use authorization, that they have every right not to take the vaccine. And there's all this information you have to give a recipient. That's not being done at all throughout the United States. You can walk into any chain pharmacy, Walmart. I don't know if you guys know what Walmart is, but it's probably in Europe. I don't know. It's it's this huge box store that's all over the United States, where a lot of people buy their groceries and all their whatever they need. People are just dispensing this vaccine. You walk in, you just sign up and say, okay, I want the vaccine, and you get the vaccine. They might point you to a piece of paper on a table that says a few of the things that that might be considered warnings, but nobody, and that's part of the lawsuit actually, that the FTC's requirement, Secretary of the Health and Human Services Department, one of the things he must do is ensure that any drug or vaccine that's emergency authorized, that anybody taking them is given all the relevant information, like it's an experimental drug, and that you need to know what the possible risks or benefits are. You also need to know if there are alternatives to this vaccine. And there are alternatives. They've also been swept under the rug from the very beginning. Hydrochloroquine and ivermectin. These are proven to work, for people with COVID, and they work. But nobody's told that when they're given the vaccine. They're never told that, hey, if you get COVID-19, there are actually proven drugs that you could take that will help you and get you over it. They're not told that. So I guess I got a little lost from your question.
No. It's a fair point, but the summary from what you just mentioned is the fact that there's over-reporting of COVID because of the changes in the death certificates and the requirements by the CDC.
Right.
And there's a complete reversal when it comes to vaccinated people that actually died from COVID after the vaccine. There's complete underreporting. So over-reporting on one side, underreporting on the other side. There's no disclosure in terms of what people should know or not know, and alternative remedies. And I guess these are some of the claims that you're raising in this litigation.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The other thing that I thought was sort of important in the claim that you filed is that you had a lot of other plaintiffs, a lot of individuals that had a lot of medical conditions as a result of the vaccines. And I think the complaint refers to all sorts of medical conditions that, at least the claim is, are attributable to the vaccines. And some of these claims relate to autoimmune disease and things of that nature. What medical information, other than the plaintiffs, what did you have to support these types of claims, other than the individual as identified in the complaint?
Well, there are a large group of doctors who are a plaintiff in this case. So, we've been working with doctors a lot.
Apologies for the loss of signal. We'll just give Jonathan a minute of time to kind of reconnect. But during the time that he's reconnecting, I do want to bring out a couple of cases that have been decided by the European Court of Human Rights. And one of those cases was decided recently, actually in April of 2021, that relates to the case filed against the Czech Republic. And it was decided on April 8, 2021, where the court actually said that mandatory vaccines with respect to children are okay, and they're compatible with the healthcare policy of each country. They, of course, the court did not address this issue of COVID vaccination, but the court did address Article 8 of the Charter, and the court did sort of talk about the mandatory vaccinations when it came to children. Prior to that, there was a case against Ukraine, where the European Court of Human Rights specifically decided that mandatory vaccinations are not allowed. However, there's an exception to that, and the court described that exception in the sphere of public health considerations. So there were a couple of decisions by the European Court of Human Rights that addressed these issues that obviously are relevant to Hungary. Jonathan, sorry, I know you got disconnected for a minute or two, so I just want to kind of bring those two cases in the European Court of Human Rights that I think are relevant as well. So now, what is it exactly that you are looking for in terms of filing this complaint? What is the group, again, the Frontline Doctors of America and some of the other plaintiffs, what are you looking for?
Well, first and foremost, I think, and perhaps the most obvious, obviously correct ruling for this court to make is that the vaccine, there should be no emergency use authorization for children. I mean, there's no statistically relevant chance of a child dying from COVID. I mean, they rarely get it, and if they get it, they don't die from it. And so the idea that they should be, be taking this vaccine is just ridiculous. I mean, young men are much more susceptible, and I'm talking about teenage men, I guess up into the 20s, they're much more susceptible to the heart inflammation proclivities of this vaccine than other people are. And there's no way that they should be taking this vaccine, given that the risk of them having any serious harm from catching COVID-19 is so minimal. It's statistically non-existent. It's like 99.99%. So why would we vaccinate them? And so that emergency use, original emergency use authorization was just for over 18. Now, I think they just recently switched it to I forget what the low age is. I think it might be, I don't know if it's, I don't know the actual number. It's like 12 to 18 something that they're now can be vaccinated with this emergency use authorization. And, the schools are pushing it. And, it's a travesty that somebody that has so little chance of being harmed by COVID-19 would have to be injected with this chemical concoction that's going to possibly cause real havoc in his body. It's insane. It's totally insane. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, it's been shown that pregnant women, it's a real problem to vaccinate pregnant women. And they're also we're trying to get the judge to say, hey, the CDC shall not authorize, even for emergency use, this vaccine for pregnant women. It shouldn't happen. And, those are the first things. But ultimately, our goal.
You have some close.
Sorry about the dogs.
Yeah, that's okay. We love dogs anyhow.
Ultimately, there should have been no emergency use authorization for this quote unquote vaccine. It's got too many it's got too many propensities that can cause harm in somebody's body. And the actual risk of harm from COVID-19 is such less than what we're being told by the media and by the government, that there's no way this vaccine should have been propagated at all, even as a so-called emergency use authorization, because, first of all, nobody is treating it like an emergency use authorization. Everybody's thinking it's like, oh, well, this is the vaccine. A lot of people, they have no idea that it's never been approved by the FDA. They're just saying, oh, well, everybody's saying to take it. Everybody's saying to take it. The governor says to take it. My boss says to take it. There should have been no emergency use authorization for either of these vaccines. And they're not even really vaccines. That's ultimately what we'd like the court to rule. But, as a fallback position, we definitely think that children should not be authorized to take this, nor should pregnant women.
So you're challenging the determination of the U.S. government in sort of saying, we will utilize the basic legal structure we have, which is the emergency use authorization. And you're challenging the validity of that decision.
Correct.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And of course, the court can make a determination that the government improperly used its authority in terms of authorizing this emergency use authorization. And of course, if that happens and there's a determination of that nature, then all these three vaccines, and we have the Moderna, we have the Pfizer, and we have the Johnson & Johnson. All these 3 vaccines, they're out, they're gone. They cannot be used anymore until you got the full approval of, the full approval then. So, so
that's right.
So what happens to the argument by a lot of individuals that there are a lot of mutations that are coming about because of unvaccinated, people? What do you guys say about that?
It's not true. I mean, I've already explained how they don't account for people that have been vaccinated that get COVID. They don't account for that. They don't have no statistics anymore to show how many of the people that did get COVID-19 recently were vaccinated or not vaccinated. And in England, I believe the official statistics, I mean, I haven't, I don't quote me on this, but that 60% of the new cases are from the vaccinated. And in addition, you have to remember that the PCR test, by the way, the CDC this week has announced that they are basically taking the PCR test off of their emergency use authorization. That was another emergency use authorization, by the way, was the PCR test. And they already stated that at the end of the year, they're withdrawing the emergency use authorization for the PCR test. So when you talk about cases rising, what you're saying is that cases based on a faulty test, which have a huge amount of false positives, those are rising. What does that tell you? What does it really tell you? There are some scientists who say 97% of PCR tests run at these high cycles, which they're all run at the high cycles, are false positives. So what does it mean? What does it really mean if the cases go up?
Well, it's just a reporting type of a thing that's basically what it boils down to. It's how you report things, and if you fudge the numbers, then you can do whatever you want. Basically, that's pretty much a summary of the argument you're making in that case. Does that sound about right?
Yes.
It's all about the math.
And also, and also when you have a 99.97% survival rate for, I think, anybody under 50, it's something like that. So if if there are more cases and they're actually legitimate cases, so what? Does that mean you should inject yourself with a concoction that, if you really look at the biological effect of taking these vaccines, it's too complicated for me to go into, and I only understand it very basically, and I don't want to talk to doctors who probably understand more than I do about it. But that you're sending these spike proteins throughout the body that are being lodged in various places in the body that originally, incidentally, the drug manufacturers, the vaccine manufacturers said that the vaccine, when it gets injected into your body, it's going to stay around the spike proteins that it basically instructs your cells to create are going to stick around the place that they were injected. There was no intimation that these spike proteins would actually go throughout the body. Well, they did go throughout the body. They do go throughout the body. And you've got women that are that have passed, they're like in their 50s and 60s who are bleeding again after they got the vaccine. That's because these spike proteins are lodging in ovaries. There's so much wrong with this vaccine. There's so much potential to harm somebody's body. The fact that cases are going up, even if they were going up, and even if they were going up only among the unvaccinated, which isn't true, so what? You don't jab poison that effectively could really harm you into your body as a result, especially when you have a 99% chance of surviving it if you do get COVID. Plus, anyway, I'm ranting a little, but
that's part of the discussion. You know, there are a number of other cases that have been filed around the U.S., and I believe you filed a separate action in your state that you briefly talked about. What is the status of the litigation? You know, these cases were recently filed. Has there been any decision by any court on these types of issues as of yet?
Yes, there have. There is a Texas judge, a group of hospital employees in Texas filed a lawsuit saying, we don't think our employer should be mandating a vaccine, that we don't think we should lose our jobs if we don't want to take the vaccine. And the federal judge basically ruled against them in a very abrupt and unusual manner, I have to say. So, you know, there's that decision.
Which basically says that an employer in the healthcare industry, hospitals or whatever, can mandate that all the employees be vaccinated, otherwise they don't have a job. So that's what the judge decided.
Right. Yeah, right. But it's a lower court decision. It doesn't have precedential value for a different judge that gets the same case. It's not an appellate court. Only appellate court decisions have precedential value, and that one doesn't. It was a lower court case. Secondly, you know, the judge, it was a bad decision, frankly. There are numerous Supreme Court decisions that recognize what is sometimes called the right to bodily integrity and the right to choose what sort of medical treatment that you're going to have, that the government cannot, force you to take any sort of treatment that it wants you to take. And so I have a case going in New Mexico against a county here. The hospital in Texas that the judge said, well, they can do it. They're a private organization. The county that I've sued in New Mexico is a government organization. They are bound by the Constitution. They can't violate constitutional rights of their employees. So we have a bit of a different situation, and we're waiting for a decision on a motion to dismiss. I mean, the defendants always file a motion to dismiss and, you know, say, oh, these people don't belong in court, and, you know, make all their arguments. And, you know, that's been fully briefed, and we're waiting to hear from the judge on that one.
You know, it seems to me that the litigation part is beginning. I mean, I don't think that we've gotten anywhere close to the Court of Appeals making a decision on any of these issues. So we have a little bit of a road ahead of us. I mean, having sort of looked at the legislative proposals, looking at some of the claims that have been filed, I mean, are you optimistic that something can be done? I mean, what is your gut feeling about all this stuff that's happening in our world? And maybe, you know, it can be more so your own opinion as opposed to your clients. Do we have any hope? Shall we have any hope?
You know, yes, I absolutely believe there's hope. How it's all going to play out, I have no idea. I mean, I know there have been some very good decisions by judges in the United States. A Florida court made a decision that for, I guess it was a county's mask mandate violated the Florida Constitution. You know, I mean, that was, you know, one of the things that I couldn't stand, that everybody was told you have to wear a mask, when all the studies show that masks don't really work for preventing transmission of viruses. I mean, I actually looked at the studies done in various countries, and, you know, they had control groups. I mean, these were real scientific studies with met all the requirements with control groups and all and so forth. You know, they said masks don't work to prevent transmission of a virus, and yet you've got the whole world wearing masks. It's another example of the insanity of this whole thing. But in any event, so Florida court has said that's a violation of a constitutional right to tell somebody they have to wear a mask. Great decision. there have been decisions, there was a decision by a federal court in Pennsylvania that all the, the mandates of the governor, all the lockdowns and, you got to stay at home and you do this and that, restaurants can't open. He said those violate constitutional rights. They're basically unlawful orders. At the time he made it, I think the decision came down, most if not all of those orders had already been changed. But, that was a great decision. The courts in Michigan, the courts in Wisconsin, the Supreme Court of Michigan, Supreme Court of Wisconsin had, they made decisions saying that the governor did not have the emergency powers to basically tell everybody what to do in those states. Those decisions were good decisions. They're on the books. They're there for us to refer to. You mentioned that many states are passing laws saying you cannot, vaccine passports will not be acceptable. You've got a decision in Florida where a federal appeals court said that the CDC can't tell Florida what to do about cruise ships. They can't make people that go on cruise ships vaccinate or whatever, get vaccinated. And that was a court of appeals in a Florida federal court that said, can't do that, unlawful. So the CDC was shut down there. I mean, there are a lot of signs for hope. The governor in my state of New Mexico is one of the most tyrannical of the governors in the whole country. She had our state locked down more than almost any state and kept it in place more than any state. And now the polls are showing that she is not going to look good. Her chances of getting reelected are not good. So there's a lot of, to me, there is a total outpouring of resistance, anger. We're not going along with this whole COVID fascism. I've never seen anything like it. I've never seen anything like the COVID fascism in the first place. But I've never seen so many people speaking out, even when they're censored on YouTube. They're getting their videos shown around on the internet. I'm inspired by how many people are standing up to this. I mean, how many people have been vaccinated? Maybe 50, 60% have been vaccinated. Why haven't the others? Because they don't believe all the propaganda. So, there's always cause for hope. I mean, you can look at it and say, oh, well, is the judge, I don't trust judges. I don't trust the judges. I think they're embedded in a system of, I think, most of them are watching mainstream news and are believing a lot of the propaganda. So I don't trust them for the most part. But there's nothing we can do as lawyers or as professionals other than to stand up to this craziness and not be intimidated, not be made to despair, and just fight it. What else can we do?
Well, Jonathan, look, I mean, we've been talking for over an hour. I do want to thank you. I'm sure that we can talk about this topic for another 2 hours easily. But it's important to be able to bring the litigation and the judicial aspect of it, and also the legislative things that are happening in the U.S., because I think the U.S. Is a leader in many different aspects around the world, and people are looking at what is happening in the U.S., and I think that was the purpose of our discussion. So, look, thank you very much. I enjoyed the approach. You're passionate about these issues. I wish you well with the litigation in Alabama. And again, thank you very much for taking the time to be part of this. And I'm sure that the Hungarian audience will appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Nagyon érdekfeszítő volt ez a beszélgetés, és jó volt hallani, hogy az amerikai ügyvédek is megerősítették, hogy igenis van remény, hiszen biztató bírósági döntések sora született már is az Egyesült Államokban, a korlátozó intézkedések, a maszkviselési kötelezettség, a kormányzati túlkapások,